He handed her a check for $10,000 of final insult after 10 years of marriage and told her she was aged out of his life. Julian genuinely believed that without his money and his status, his ex-wife Sophie would crumble. He expected her to fade into obscurity crying in a small apartment while he paraded his 23-year-old mistress through the Hamptons. He was wrong. 6 months later, on a humid night in Monaco, Julian stood on a crowded dock and watched the impossible happen. He didn't just see Sophie survive, he watched her ascend. And the man waiting for her on the deck of the world's most exclusive Mega-Yacht wasn't just rich, he was the one man Julian terrified of. This is the story of the ultimate revenge. The conference room at Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher and Flom on 4th Avenue was freezing. It was a deliberate tactic, of course. Sophie knew that. They kept the air conditioning blasting to make the weaker party shiver to make them want to sign, just to get out of the cold. Sophie sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the mahogany table. She wasn't shivering. She was wearing a 3-year-old beige cashmere sweater from Loro Piana, one of the last gifts Julian had bought her before he stopped caring, and she looked at the man sitting across from her. Julian looked like $1 million, literally. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit from Savile Row, his hair perfectly coiffed, and on his wrist sat a rose-gold Audemars Piguet Royal Oak. He didn't look at her. He was too busy scrolling through his phone, likely texting her. Bella. The 24-year-old influencer he'd moved into their Tribeca penthouse 3 days ago. "Let's wrap this up," Julian said, finally dropping his phone onto the table with a heavy thud. "I have a flight to Aspen at 3. Sophie, look, my lawyers have been generous, extremely generous." His lead attorney, a shark-like man named Arthur Penhaligon, slid a thick document across the table. "As discussed, Mrs. Vance, the prenuptial agreement you signed 10 years ago is ironclad. However, Mr. Vance is offering a goodwill payment of $50,000 to assist with your transition." $50,000. They had been married for a decade. Sophie had dropped out of her master's program at Sotheby's Institute of Art to manage Julian's life. She had hosted his dinners, charmed his investors from Goldman Sachs, decorated his 3 properties, and nursed him through his bout with pneumonia in 2019. She had built the social network that allowed his hedge fund, Vance Capital, to thrive. And now she was being fired. That's what this felt like. A severance package for a redundant employee. "You're keeping the apartment?" Sophie asked. Her voice was quiet, scratchy. "Sophie, be realistic." Julian sighed, finally making eye contact. His eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth she remembered from their college days. "You can't afford the maintenance fees on the Tribeca place. I'm doing you a favor. Bella, well, I need the space. We're entertaining a lot more." He said her name on purpose. Bella. A twist of the knife. "And the house in the Hamptons." "Mine," Julian said sharply. "Purchased through the LLC. You know this?" Sophie looked down at the paper. $50,000. It wouldn't even cover a deposit on a decent apartment in Manhattan these days. She was 36 years old. Her resume had a 10-year gap. Her friends were actually Julian's friends' wives of his business partners who would drop her the second the ink was dry. Arthur the lawyer uncapped a Mont Blanc pen and held it out. "If we go to trial, Sophie, we will crush you. We will expose the mental health episodes." Sophie froze. She had seen a therapist twice after her miscarriage 3 years ago. Julian had called it her breakdown. Now he was weaponizing her grief. She looked at Julian. He was smirking, a tiny, imperceptible lift of the corner of his mouth. He wanted a scene. He wanted her to scream, to cry, to beg. He wanted to tell his friends later over scotch at the Soho house that his crazy ex-wife had to be dragged out by security. He wanted validation that he was the prize. Sophie took a deep breath. She reached out and took the pen. "Okay," she whispered. Julian blinked. "Okay." "I just want it to be over, Julian." She signed her name. Sophie Thorne. She dropped the Vance immediately. Julian looked almost disappointed by her lack of fight. He snatched the papers back, checking the signature. Smart girl. You always were pragmatic, mostly. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. Look, Soph, don't take this the wrong way. You're a great woman. You stopped evolving. I need someone who matches my trajectory. I understand, Sophie said, standing up. She picked up her old leather tote bag. Take the check, Julian said, flicking a piece of paper toward her. Buy yourself a vacation. Go to, I don't know, Ohio, visit your parents. My parents are dead, Julian, she said softly. Right. Well, whatever. He checked his watch. I gotta run. Bella is waiting in the car. He walked out without looking back. Arthur, the lawyer, gave her a pitying nod and followed. Sophie stood alone in the multi-million-dollar conference room. She walked to the window, looking out over the gray New York skyline. She felt light, terrifyingly light. She had no husband, no home, no money, and no career, but she also had no secrets. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small black notebook. It wasn't a diary, it was a ledger. For 10 years, Sophie had managed the household expenses, but she had also listened. She sat at the dinners where Julian bragged. She knew about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands that Vance Capital hadn't declared to the IRS. She knew about the consulting fees paid to the senator's son to get regulatory approval. She hadn't used it in the divorce. That would have been blackmail, and Julian would have buried her in litigation for years. She didn't want his money. She wanted him to think she was weak. She wanted him to stop watching her. Matches your trajectory, she whispered to the empty room. She put the notebook back in her bag. She wasn't going to Ohio. She was going to get her life back, and she was going to start by reclaiming the one thing he couldn't take her eye for value. 6 months later. The humidity in New York was oppressive, but inside the gallery of Henri Duval in Chelsea, the air was crisp and smelled of lemon oil and old canvas. Sophie was on her knees, carefully removing a layer of varnish from a 17th-century frame. Her hands were stained with solvents. She was wearing paint-splattered coveralls, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She was making $22 an hour. It was a far cry from the Hamptons galas, but Sophie had never been happier. Henri, an eccentric elderly Frenchman who had been one of the few people from her old life to return her calls, had given her a chance. You have the eye, chérie, Henri had told her when she begged for a job. But you have been blind for 10 years. She was learning to see again. She lived in a studio apartment in Queens that smelled of curry from the restaurant downstairs. She took the subway. She ate ramen. And every night she studied the art market. She tracked auction results from Christie's and Sotheby's. She read about emerging artists. Julian was everywhere, unfortunately. He was on the cover of Forbes, listed as a titan of industry. The tabloid's page 6 specifically loved documenting his romance with Bella. Julian Vance and fiancée Bella Sterling spotted shopping for engagement rings at Tiffany & Company flagship. Julian Vance purchases $40 million Mega-Yacht, dubbing it the Bella V. Sophie read the news on her lunch break, eating a yogurt. It stung, but the pain was dulling. It was becoming fuel. Sophie, Henri called out from the front of the gallery. We have a VIP client coming in 10 minutes. I need you to hide the solvents and look presentable, or vanish. Who is it? Sophie asked, wiping her hands. A proxy buyer, representing someone from Europe, looking for the Turner Seascape. Sophie nodded. The Turner was the gallery's prized possession, listed at $4.5 million. She quickly tidied the back room. She didn't have time to change, so she decided to vanish. She grabbed her bag and headed for the back exit. As she opened the heavy steel door to the alley, she heard the front chime ring. A voice drifted through, deep, accented, polite, but commanding. Monsieur Duval, I trust the piece is ready for inspection. Sophie paused. She knew that voice. Not personally, but she had heard it on CNBC in interviews. It wasn't the proxy, it was the buyer himself. She peeked through the crack in the door. Standing there looking at the painting with intensity was Adrian Thorne, no relation to her maiden name, just a cosmic irony. Adrian was a ghost, a tech mogul who had sold his AI infrastructure company to Google for $12 billion and then disappeared. He was known for two things: being ruthlessly private and having a taste for things that were impossible to get. He was taller than Julian, broader, with silver-flecked beard and eyes that looked like they could scan a balance sheet in a microsecond. "It is beautiful," Adrian said. But, Henri looked nervous. "The provenance," Adrian said. "There is a gap between 1940 and 1946. Given the era, I cannot risk purchasing a piece that might be looted art. My reputation cannot sustain that," Henri stammered. "I assure you, Mr. Thorne—" "The gap isn't a gap," Sophie said. She hadn't meant to speak. It just came out. She stepped out from the back room, still in her dirty coveralls. Adrian Thorne turned. His eyes swept over her, not with the dismissive look Julian used, but with a calculating curiosity. "Excuse me." Henri looked horrified. "Sophie, please leave us." "No." Adrian raised a hand. "Let her speak. You know about the provenance." Sophie took a breath. She walked over to the painting. "The gap in the paperwork exists because this painting wasn't in a gallery during the war. It was in the basement of the Chateau de Chambord, hidden by the curator along with the Mona Lisa to protect it from the Nazis. If you look at the back of the frame under the sublayer, there should be a faint charcoal mark, a double C. That was the code used by the resistance transport teams." Silence filled the room. Adrian looked at Henri. "Is this true?" I have never looked under the sublayer," Henri admitted. "Do it," Adrian commanded. "Now." Henri carefully took the painting down. With trembling hands and Sophie's guidance, they peeled back the protective backing paper. There, faint but undeniable, was a charcoal CC. Adrian Thorne let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. He looked at the painting with renewed reverence. Then he turned to Sophie. "You are a restorer." "I'm learning," Sophie said. "I used to be an advisor, in a past life. You have an incredible eye for detail. And you know history. What is your name?" "Sophie." "Just Sophie. For now." Adrian studied her for a moment, his gaze intense. "I am looking for an acquisition curator. Someone who doesn't just look at the price tag, but looks at the bones of the thing. My current team is sycophantic. They tell me what I want to hear." He pulled a card from his pocket. It wasn't paper. It was heavy black metal with gold embossing. "I am hosting a viewing party in Monaco next month. It is the weekend of the Grand Prix. I am unveiling a collection. I want you to come. I want you to assess the collection before I reveal it to the public. If you find any other hidden marks, I will hire you on the spot. Annual salary starts at $500,000. Sophie stared at the card. Monaco, the Grand Prix. It was the center of the universe for the super-rich in May. I can't afford to get to Monaco," she said honestly. She wasn't going to pretend. Adrian smiled. It transformed his face, making him look younger, dangerous, but charming. "I'll send a plane. Teterboro Airport. Friday at 8:00 a.m. Don't be late, Sophie." He walked out, leaving the scent of sandalwood and absolute power in his wake. Henri looked at Sophie, his mouth agape. "Mon Dieu, do you know who that was?" "Yes," Sophie said, clutching the metal card. "That was my way out." But she didn't know the half of it. Because Monaco during the Grand Prix wasn't just about art. It was about status. And where there was status, there was Julian. The plane wasn't just a plane. It was a Gulfstream G650ER painted in matte black. And she was the only passenger. Sophie spent the 7-hour flight sipping sparkling water and reading the dossier Adrian's assistant had emailed her. She wasn't going as a guest. She was going as a consultant. This was work. She told herself that repeatedly. She wasn't going to find a Prince Charming. She was going to secure a career so she never had to depend on a man like Julian again. When she landed in Nice, a helicopter was waiting to shuttle her to Monaco. The view coming in was breathtaking: the azure water, the winding roads, the density of wealth packed into the tiny principality. She was dropped off at the Hôtel de Paris, the most legendary hotel in Monte Carlo. "Mr. Thorne has arranged a suite for you," the concierge said, bowing low. "And he suggested you might need this for the evening's event." He handed her a large white box tied with a black ribbon. Up in her suite, which was larger than her entire apartment in Queens, Sophie opened the box. Inside was a dress. It was a vintage Alexander McQueen black silk structured in severe, yet incredibly sexy. It was armor. There was a note. "Wear this. The sharks are circling tonight. A." Sophie did her hair in a sleek high ponytail and put on the dress. It fit perfectly. She applied red lipstick, a color Julian had always forbidden because he said it looked cheap. Tonight it looked lethal. The event was being held at the Oceanographic Museum, a stunning building on the cliffside. Sophie arrived alone. The paparazzi were screaming names, flashes popping like strobe lights. She kept her head high and walked past them. She didn't matter to them, not yet. Inside, the room was dripping with diamonds and champagne. It was the Billionaire set. Tech tycoons, oil heirs, Russian oligarchs. Sophie took a glass of champagne and moved to the edges, scanning the art on the walls. It was an impressive collection, Modigliani's Basquiat's. Adrian had taste. "Well, well, I thought I smelled cheap perfume." The voice made Sophie's blood turn to ice. She turned slowly. Julian was standing there. He looked tan-polished and slightly drunk. He was holding a tumbler of whiskey. Hanging on his arm was Bella. Bella looked stunning, undeniably. She was wearing a sheer, glittering gold dress that left little to the imagination. She looked at Sophie with a mixture of pity and amusement. "Sophie," Bella chirped. "Oh my God, what are you doing here? Did you sneak in?" Julian sneered. "Who are you with? Did you pick up a waiter, or maybe you're working catering?" He laughed at his own joke. "Actually, that makes sense. You always were good at serving people." Sophie tightened her grip on her glass. "I'm here on business, Julian." "Business?" Julian scoffed. "What business? You're a housewife, Sophie. A retired housewife." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Look, it's embarrassing that you're here. Really, it looks desperate. Stalking me to Monaco. It's sad." "I didn't know you were here, Julian," Sophie said calmly, though her heart was hammering. "Bullshit. Everyone knows Vance Capital is sponsoring the after-party on the yacht. Look, do yourself a favor. Go back to the hotel, pack your bags, and go home. You don't belong in this world anymore. You were a passenger, Sophie. The ride is over." Bella giggled. "Babe, don't be mean. Maybe she can grab a gift bag on the way out." Tears pricked Sophie's eyes. Not of sadness, but of rage. Pure, hot rage. He still had the power to make her feel small. "Is there a problem here?" The crowd seemed to part. Adrian Thorne stepped through. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. He didn't look at Julian. He looked only at Sophie. "Adrian," Julian said, his voice suddenly shifting from bullying to fawning. "Mr. Thorne, I'm Julian Vance. We met at Davos last year. Big fan of your—" Adrian ignored him completely. He stepped up to Sophie and gently placed a hand on the small of her back. "Sophie," Adrian said, his voice low and intimate. "I was looking for you. The curator from the Louvre is dying to meet you. He wants to discuss your theory on the Turner." Julian froze. "Curator." Adrian finally turned his cold gaze to Julian. "And you are—" I'm Julian Vance, Sophie's ex-husband." "Ah," Adrian said. His face showed zero emotion. "The ex-husband." He looked Julian up and down, then glanced at Bella, then back to Julian. "I see. It was the most insulting IC in history. It implied that Julian had downgraded massively. "Sophie is my guest of honor," Adrian said, "and my new head of acquisitions. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have business to discuss with people who actually matter." He guided Sophie away. As they walked away, Sophie could feel Julian's eyes boring into her back. She heard him whisper furiously to Bella, "What the hell just happened?" Sophie looked up at Adrian. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Adrian murmured. "I just hate bullies, and I hate men who don't know the value of what they're holding. But Sophie, the night isn't over. Julian is going to try to corner you again. He's a narcissist. He can't handle what just happened." "I know," Sophie said. "Good." Adrian stopped and turned her to face him. "Because I have a proposition. Julian is trying to get an allocation in my new venture fund. He's desperate for it. He's leveraged himself to the hilt to buy that yacht and keep up this lifestyle. If you want, we can break him." Sophie looked at Adrian. "Break him? I can deny his allocation. I can blacklist him from the deal. His investors will panic. His stock will tank. But I only do it if you give the word. It's your call." Sophie looked across the room. Julian was yelling at a waiter, his face red. Bella was looking at her phone, bored. "Not yet," Sophie said. A plan was forming in her mind. "Denying him is too easy. I don't want him to just lose money. I want him to lose his pride." Adrian smiled, a wolfish grin. "I think I'm going to enjoy working with you, Sophie. Tomorrow is the yacht party. Everyone will be there, including Julian. Meet me at the dock at 9 p.m. And Sophie." "Yes." "Bring the notebook." Sophie stopped breathing. "How do you know about the notebook?" "I know everything, Sophie. That's why I hired you. You're the only person who knows where the bodies are buried." The morning sun over the Mediterranean was blinding, but the blackout curtains in Adrian's suite at the Hotel de Paris were drawn tight. The room hummed with the quiet whir of high-end electronics. Sophie sat at a glass table, the black notebook open in front of her. Adrian stood behind her, looking over her shoulder. He wasn't touching her, but his presence was a heavy electric weight. "Walk me through it again," Adrian said. His voice was all business now. Sophie ran her finger down a column of dates and numbers scrawled in her handwriting. 3 years ago, Julian's firm Vance Capital was struggling. His returns were flat and investors were pulling out to move to index funds. He was desperate. Then suddenly he made a massive bet against a pharmaceutical company called Corello Pharma. "I remember Corello," Adrian said, walking around the table to pour 2 espressos. "They were developing a revolutionary Alzheimer's drug. The Phase 2 trials looked promising. The stock was soaring. Betting against them was suicide." "Exactly," Sophie said. "Unless you knew for a fact the FDA was going to reject the Phase 3 trial data before it was public." Adrian placed a cup in front of her. "And he knew. He was sleeping with the lead compliance officer's assistant at the FDA, a woman named Sarah. He bought her a condo in D.C. under a shell company. She fed him the rejection data 2 days before the press release." Sophie tapped the page. "He shorted the stock with 80% of the fund's liquidity, leveraged 5-to-1. When the news broke, Corello's stock dropped 70% in 10 minutes. Julian made $40 million in an afternoon. It saved the firm. It bought the penthouse. It bought the Hamptons house. And it's illegal," Adrian said softly. "Insider trading. Market manipulation. Jail time." "It's not just illegal, Adrian. It's traceable. I have the dates of his business trips to D.C. that align perfectly with the trade. And," she flipped to the back of the notebook, "I have the account number for the shell company in the British Virgin Islands that pays the mortgage on Sarah's condo." He was sloppy. He used his personal email to set up the wire transfers, thinking he deleted the thread. "I recovered it from the trash folder when I was syncing his iPad." Adrian picked up the notebook. He looked at it like it was a loaded weapon. "Why didn't you use this during the divorce?" he asked, studying her face. Because I was scared, Sophie admitted, looking down at her coffee. Julian has friends in low places. Arthur, his lawyer. They terrified me. I thought if I tried to blackmail him, they'd make me disappear or frame me for something. I just wanted to survive. And now, Sophie looked up. Her eyes were dry and hard. Now I don't just want to survive. I want to balance the books. Adrian smiled. It was a terrifying smile. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Get me James Sterling at the Financial Times," Adrian said into the phone. "And tell the legal team at the SEC Enforcement Division, the one we helped with the crypto fraud case, that I have a whistleblower package coming their way. Anonymous for now." He hung up and looked at Sophie. Tonight is the yacht party. Julian is hosting a gala on his boat, the Bella V. He's trying to close a $100 million round of funding from the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. If he closes that deal, he becomes too big to fail. "He won't close it," Sophie said. "No, he won't, because while he's playing captain on his rental yacht, you and I are going to steal the show, and then we're going to sink him." Adrian walked over to a garment rack that had been rolled into the room earlier that morning. He unzipped a garment bag. "For tonight," he said. It wasn't black. It was a gown of liquid silver encrusted with thousands of tiny Swarovski crystals. It looked like moonlight woven into fabric. It was a custom Versace fresh from the atelier in Milan. "Julian likes to treat you like you're invisible," Adrian said. "Tonight you are going to be the brightest thing in the harbor. Tonight we make sure he sees exactly what he threw away." The Port Hercules harbor in Monaco at night is a theater of excess. The water reflects the lights of the casino and the high-rises, turning the bay into a kaleidoscope of gold and neon. The docks were crowded. Tourists were pressed against the railings trying to catch glimpses of celebrities. Julian Vance stood on the aft deck of the Bella V. It was a respectable yacht, 145 feet long, sleek white, built by Sunseeker. It cost him $300,000 to charter for the week, a sum he could barely afford, but he needed to project success. He was holding court with 3 men and Thobe's representatives from the Saudi Investment Fund. "The returns are guaranteed," Julian was saying, his smile tight. "Our algorithm is proprietary. We anticipate a 22% yield this year. Vance Capital is the future." Bella was standing next to him, looking bored, scrolling through Instagram. She tugged on his sleeve. "Julian, the champagne is warm. Tell the crew to fix it." "In a minute, babe," Julian hissed. He turned back to the investors. "Gentlemen, if you'll just look at the prospectus." Suddenly, the loud deep horn of a ship blasted across the harbor, vibrating the champagne glasses on the table. Every head on the dock turned. The tourists started screaming and pointing. Entering the harbor was a monster. It was a Giga-Yacht, easily 350 feet long. Its hull was painted a deep, menacing charcoal gray, almost black. It didn't look like a pleasure craft. It looked like a warship designed for a Bond villain. It towered over every other boat in the marina, making the Bella V look like a dinghy. "What is that?" Bella asked, her mouth open. "That," one of the Saudi investors said, his voice filled with awe, "is the Sovereign. It belongs to Adrian Thorne. It is rarely seen. It is magnificent." Julian felt a knot of jealousy tighten in his stomach. He hated Adrian Thorne. He hated that Thorne had humiliated him at the gala. The Sovereign maneuvered with impossible grace, its thrusters churning the water white. It docked directly opposite the Bella V, stealing Julian's view, stealing his air, stealing his audience. A ramp, a long illuminated gangway lined with white LEDs, began to lower from the side of the Sovereign. "Let's see who he's got with him," Julian muttered, taking a sip of his drink. "Probably some supermodels. Typical tech bro trash." The gangway touched the dock. Security guards in black suits flanked the entrance. Then a couple emerged. The man was Adrian Thorne, looking impeccable in a white tuxedo jacket. But no one was looking at him. They were looking at the woman on his arm. She was wearing a dress that seemed to be made of liquid mercury. It shimmered with every step. She wore diamonds at her throat that caught the harbor lights, a necklace that looked suspiciously like the Cartier Tutti Frutti piece that had sold at auction last month for $6 million. She walked with her head high, her posture regal, radiating a cold, untouchable beauty. Julian squinted. The woman looked familiar. The way she walked, the tilt of her head. She turned slightly to wave at the crowd, and the light hit her face. Julian dropped his glass. It shattered on the teak deck, splashing whiskey over his bespoke loafers. "Sophie," he whispered. Bella looked up. "What? That's Sophie." "Your ex-wife." Bella laughed nervously. "Don't be stupid. Sophie wears cardigans and shops at Target. That woman is wearing a dress that costs more than your car." But Julian knew. He felt it in his gut. Sophie and Adrian reached the bottom of the gangway. Instead of getting into a waiting limousine, they stopped. Adrian whispered something to her. Sophie smiled a genuine, dazzling smile that Julian hadn't seen in years, and nodded. They turned and walked along the dock. They were walking toward the Bella V. "They're coming here," the Saudi investor said, straightening his robe. "Mr. Thorne is coming here." Julian panicked. "Fix the mess," he yelled at a steward, pointing at the broken glass. "Bella, stand up straight." Sophie and Adrian stopped on the dock right below where Julian was standing on the deck of his rented boat. The height difference was symbolic. Julian was 10 feet above her, but he had never felt smaller. "Julian," Adrian called out. His voice carried easily over the water. "I hope we aren't interrupting your pitch." Julian gripped the railing. "Thorne, what do you want?" "I just wanted to introduce you to my new partner," Adrian said, gesturing to Sophie. Sophie looked up. She locked eyes with Julian. There was no fear in her eyes anymore. There was no longing. There was just pity. "Hello, Julian," she said. Her voice was clear and melodic. "Lovely boat. It's cozy." The crowd on the dock laughed. "Sophie," Julian stammered. "What are you doing? You're making a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Julian," she said, adjusting her $6 million necklace. "I'm making an acquisition. Adrian and I just finalized the purchase of the Corello Pharma patent portfolio. You remember Corello, don't you?" The color drained from Julian's face. "Corello." "Yes." Sophie continued, speaking loud enough for the Saudi investors to hear. "We're reopening the investigation into the data leak 3 years ago. We found some discrepancies in the trading logs." Julian felt the world tilt. She knew. "You're crazy," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a bitter ex-wife." "Am I?" Sophie asked. She reached into her small crystal clutch and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it up. "I have the receipts, Julian. Literally. The Cayman transfers, the D.C. condo." She didn't explain further. She didn't have to. She simply tucked the paper back into her purse. "Enjoy your evening," she said. "I hear the SEC is very active in this time zone." She took Adrian's arm and they turned away, walking back toward the looming majestic shadow of the Sovereign. Julian stood frozen. The Saudi investors were looking at him. They were looking at his shaking hands. They were looking at the fear in his eyes. "Mr. Vance," the lead investor said, his tone icy, "I think we will postpone signing the agreement. We need to reassess our due diligence." "No." Julian spun around. "Wait. She's lying. She's mentally unstable. It's a ploy." But the investors were already walking toward the exit ramp. They didn't want to be anywhere near a man who had just been publicly marked for death by Adrian Thorne. The party on the Bella V died instantly. The guests, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, began to trickle away. No one wanted to be associated with the sinking ship. Julian stormed into the master cabin, slamming the door. He poured himself a drink, his hands trembling so badly the bottle rattled against the glass. "What was that?" Bella shrieked, following him in. "Why did the Saudis leave, Julian? You promised me that investment was a done deal." You promised we were buying the penthouse in Miami next week." "Shut up, Bella," Julian roared. He loosened his tie, gasping for air. "I need to think." His phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was Arthur, his lawyer in New York. It was 4:00 a.m. in New York. Lawyers didn't call at 4:00 a.m. unless the building was on burning. Julian answered. "Arthur, tell me you can fix this slander." "Julian, shut up and listen." Arthur's voice was panicked. "The FBI just raided the office." Julian dropped into a leather chair. "What?" "They have a warrant. Federal agents. They're seizing the servers. They're asking for the Corello file specifically." "Julian, who did you talk to?" "Who has the ledger?" "The ledger," Julian whispered. "Sophie." "Sophie!" Arthur screamed. "Your wife. You told me she knew nothing. You told me she was a decorate-the-house idiot." I thought she was." "Well, she just handed the DOJ a roadmap to your prison cell. And it gets worse, because the news of the raid just hit the Bloomberg terminal." "What does that mean?" "It means the banks are reacting. Goldman just pulled your prime brokerage line. They're issuing a margin call on the entire portfolio. You have 1 hour to post $40 million in cash collateral, or they liquidate your positions." "I don't have $40 million in cash," Julian yelled. "It's all tied up in the yacht, the houses, the private equity deals." "Then you're broke, Julian. You're done. I'm resigning as your counsel effective immediately. I'm not going down for aiding and abetting. Don't call me again." The line went dead. Julian stared at the phone. Another notification popped up. It was a push notification from Wall Street Journal. "Breaking Vance Capital raided by FBI in insider trading probe. Whistleblower links fund to FDA leaks." He looked up. Bella was reading the same notification on her phone. Her face was pale. She looked around the cabin at the expensive furniture, the champagne, the illusion of wealth. Then she looked at Julian, sweating and defeated in the chair. "You're broke?" she asked, her voice small. It's a liquidity issue." Julian lied, desperate. "I just need a few days. Bella, baby, I need you to support me right now. We can fix this." Bella looked at him. The calculations were happening behind her eyes. She was 24. She had options. Being the girlfriend of an indicted fraudster was not on her vision board. "I can't be here," she said. "What? My brand?" she said, backing away. "I can't have my brand associated with federal crimes. I have sponsors, Julian." "Your brand?" Julian laughed hysterically. "I bought your brand, I bought your followers, I paid for everything you're wearing." "And now you can't pay for anything," she snapped. She grabbed her purse, a Hermes Birkin he had bought her last week. "I'm taking the tender to shore. I'm flying back to L.A. tonight." "Bella, wait." She didn't wait. The door slammed shut. Julian was alone. He stood up and stumbled out onto the deck. The harbor was quiet now. The party was over. The staff were silently cleaning up, casting nervous glances at him. He looked across the water. The Sovereign was still there, glowing like a dark jewel. On the top deck he could see 2 silhouettes leaning against the railing. He knew it was them, Sophie and Adrian. They were watching him. Sophie was holding a glass of wine, looking across the gap between the yachts. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't cheering. She was just watching. Witnessing the collapse of the structure she had helped build, the structure that had rejected her. Julian felt a surge of hatred so pure it made him dizzy. He wanted to scream at her. He wanted to blame her. But as he looked at the police lights flashing on the shore, French police cars pulling up to the dock where his boat was moored, he realized the truth. He hadn't aged her out. He hadn't discarded her. He had underestimated her. And in the world of high finance, underestimating your risk is the one sin that is never forgiven. He watched as 2 French officers walked up the gangway of the Bella V. Julian Vance straightened his jacket. He took one last look at the ex-wife standing on the billion-dollar deck, unreachable, untouchable. "Well played, Sophie," he whispered into the salt air. The officers stepped onto the deck. "Monsieur Vance." Julian nodded. He held out his hands. The concept of time changes when you strip away the markers of a high-end life. For Julian Vance, time used to be measured in quarterly earnings reports, flight durations to Davos, and the sweeping second hand of a Patek Philippe. Now, 18 months into a 7-year sentence, at the Federal Correctional Institution, Otisville time was measured in the rhythmic, maddening buzzing of the fluorescent lights and the heavy metallic clank of the automated locking mechanisms. Otisville was known in the press as a club fed, a place where white-collar criminals went to play tennis and wait out their sentences. But the reality was far grimmer. It was a warehouse for men who had once been gods of their own tiny universes, now reduced to inventory numbers. Julian was inmate number 89402B. He sat in the communal recreation room, a space that smelled permanently of industrial pine cleaner and stale body odor. The air conditioning was broken, a stifling humidity hanging over the plastic chairs. It was a Tuesday evening, which meant news hour. Julian usually avoided the news. The financial segments were too painful. Seeing the ticker tape scroll across the bottom of the screen, the S&P 500 hitting record highs, tech stocks soaring, felt like watching a party through a window that had been bricked over. He had missed the greatest bull run in a decade while sitting in a cage. "Yo, Vance," a bulky inmate named Miller grunted. Miller had been a corrupt union boss in Jersey. He liked tormenting Julian. "Turn it up. Your girl is on." Julian froze. He looked up from the book he was pretending to read, a tattered paperback thriller from the prison library. On the wall-mounted television, the screen had shifted to a live feed from London. The banner at the bottom read, "Breaking Phoenix Partners acquires historic Sotheby's lot." But the camera wasn't focused on an auctioneer. It was focused on a woman standing at a podium inside the Tate Modern. It was Sophie. Julian felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him lightheaded. He hadn't seen her since the night on the dock in Monaco, the night the police lights had reflected in her diamonds. She looked magnificent and terrifying. Gone was the soft, eager-to-please housewife who used to fret over whether the napkins matched the tablecloths. The woman on the screen was carved from marble. She wore a cream-colored structured suit from the row, the kind that cost more than the average American car. Her hair was cut in a sharp asymmetrical bob that framed a face radiating absolute unshakable confidence. She wasn't just a participant in the economy anymore. She was a titan. "We are pleased." Sophie spoke into the microphone, her voice clear and modulated, "to announce the launch of the Restoration Initiative. This is a $100 million endowment dedicated to recovering, restoring, and returning stolen and looted art to its rightful owners." A journalist from the BBC raised a hand. "Ms. Thorne, this is a massive commitment. Can you speak to the source of the initial funding? There are rumors that this capital was derived from a rather contentious liquidation." Julian leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the plastic armrests of his chair. "Don't say it," he prayed. "Don't you dare say my name." Sophie smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. She looked directly into the camera lens, and for a second, Julian felt like she was staring right into the damp, miserable common room in upstate New York. "Transparency is the cornerstone of my new life," Sophie said. "So yes, I can confirm the source. The initial capital for this foundation was raised through the aggressive acquisition and subsequent liquidation of the distressed assets of Vance Capital." The room in the prison went silent. Even Miller stopped chewing his gum. "We purchased the firm's real estate portfolio at auction," Sophie continued, her voice smooth as silk, "including a penthouse in Tribeca and an estate in the Hamptons. We found that the previous owner had over-leveraged these properties. By stripping them down, removing the excess, and selling them at fair market value, we generated a significant surplus. I suppose you could say my ex-husband finally made a positive contribution to the world of culture. It just cost him everything he owned to do it. The press corps erupted in laughter. It wasn't polite laughter. It was genuine amusement at the brutality of the takedown. Julian felt a physical blow to his chest. She had bought his house, the Hamptons' house. The one he had told her was purchased through the LLC, so she couldn't touch it. She hadn't just touched it. She had bought it for pennies on the dollar, flipped it, and used the profit to build a monument to her own benevolence. "That's cold, Vance," Miller laughed, shaking his head in mock sympathy. "She didn't just divorce you, she liquidated you." Julian stood up, his legs shaking. He couldn't watch anymore. He turned and walked back toward his cell, the sound of Sophie's voice following him down the concrete corridor. Restoration is about seeing value where others see trash. He reached his cell and collapsed onto the thin mattress. He closed his eyes, but he couldn't shut out the image. He thought about the notebook, the black ledger he had ignored for years. He had thought she was writing grocery lists. He had thought she was planning dinner parties. He realized now, too late, that she had been the only person in the room who was actually paying attention. He had built a house of cards, and he had handed her the fan. The view from the summit. 400 miles away, the Atlantic Ocean crashed rhythmically against the dunes of East Hampton. The house on Lily Pond Lane was unrecognizable from the mausoleum of gray marble and chrome that Julian Vance had built. The gates were open. The driveway, once lined with pretentious imported Italian cypress trees that couldn't survive the salt air, was now bordered by wild hydrangeas and beach plums. Sophie sat on the expansive teak deck, her legs tucked under her. She was wearing a simple cashmere sweater and linen pants, holding a glass of vintage Sancerre. The air smelled of salt jasmine and victory. The screen door slid open with a soft hush. Adrian Thorne stepped out. He was barefoot, wearing a faded navy t-shirt and jeans. It was a stark contrast to the tuxedo he had worn in Monaco, but Sophie preferred him this way. This was the man, not the myth. "The press conference is trending," Adrian said, sitting on the edge of her lounge chair. "The Financial Times just ran an op-ed calling you the Robin Hood of the art world, although technically Robin Hood didn't keep a 10% management fee." Sophie laughed, the sound free and light. "I earned that fee. Dealing with the SEC lawyers regarding Julian's forfeiture took 5 years off my life." "It was worth it," Adrian said. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm, his grip solid. Their relationship defied the easy labels the tabloids tried to stick on them. Were they lovers? Yes. Were they business partners? Absolutely. But mostly they were two people who had seen the darker side of human nature and decided to build their own light. Adrian had never tried to rescue her. He had simply handed her the weapon, the checkbook, the introduction, the platform, and watched her swing it. "I got a letter today," Sophie said, looking out at the darkening horizon where the sea met the sky. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Fan mail?" "Not exactly. It was from Bella." "The influencer?" Adrian scoffed. "I thought she moved to Dubai to find an oil tycoon." "Apparently that didn't work out. She's back in Los Angeles. She's rebranding as a wellness coach." Sophie took a sip of her wine. "She wrote to ask if I would be interested in investing in her new startup. She said that considering we have shared history, she thought I would want to support women, uplifting women." Adrian laughed so hard he nearly choked on his water. "You have got to be kidding me. The woman who stood on the yacht and laughed at your dress, the woman who called you a passenger. The very same." "What did you do with the letter?" Sophie smiled. "I had my assistant send her a standard rejection letter, the same form letter Julian used to send to failed startups. I thought the symmetry was poetic." She set her glass down on the table. The wind was picking up a cool breeze that signaled the end of summer. Sophie looked around the deck. This house used to be a symbol of her inadequacy. Julian had designed every inch of it to make her feel small, to make her feel like a guest in her own marriage. He had chosen the furniture. She wasn't allowed to sit on the art. She wasn't allowed to critique the life she wasn't allowed to lead. Now she had gutted it. She had torn out the marble floors and installed reclaimed white oak. She had taken down the generic investment-grade pop art and replaced it with moody, complex seascapes by emerging artists she believed in. She had exorcised the ghost of Julian Vance, not with sage, but with success. "Do you ever think about him?" Adrian asked quietly, sensing her mood shift. Sophie paused. She looked at the lighthouse blinking in the distance at Montauk Point. "I used to," she admitted. "In the beginning, when I was working at the gallery scrubbing varnish off old frames. I used to think about him every day. I used to replay the divorce meeting in my head, wishing I had screamed, wishing I had thrown the chair through the window. And now, Sophie turned to look at Adrian. Her eyes were clear, devoid of the shadows that had haunted her for a decade. "Now I realize that he was necessary. I was asleep, Adrian. For 10 years I was sleepwalking through a life that didn't fit me. He woke me up. He pushed me off the cliff. He didn't know I could fly, but he's the reason I had to learn." Adrian smiled, a genuine soft expression that softened the sharp angles of his face. "You didn't just learn to fly, Sophie. You learned to hunt." "Maybe," she whispered. She stood up and walked to the railing. Below, the waves crashed against the shore, eroding the sand, changing the landscape bit by bit. It was a reminder that nothing was permanent. Wealth, status, power, it could all be washed away in a single tide cycle if you weren't paying attention. Julian hadn't paid attention. He had looked at the price tag of everything and the value of nothing. Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. It was the cheap plastic pen she had accidentally kept from the law firm that day, the pen she had used to sign the divorce papers, the pen she had used to sign away her rights for $50,000. She had kept it in her purse for 2 years as a reminder of her lowest moment. She held it over the railing. "What's that?" Adrian asked. "The last piece of inventory," Sophie said. She opened her hand. The pen fell tumbling down through the cool night air, disappearing into the dune grass below. It was gone. "Come inside," Adrian said, standing up and holding out his hand. "I opened a bottle of the 82 Latour, and the curator from the Louvre is calling at 9. He wants to know if you're serious about buying the Vermeer." Sophie took his hand. "I'm always serious, Adrian." They walked back into the warm golden light of the house, sliding the glass door shut against the night, leaving the cold and the dark outside where it belonged. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the anatomy of the ultimate clapback. Julian Vance thought he was discarding a depreciating asset. He thought he could write Sophie off like a bad debt. But he forgot the golden rule of business and of life. Information is currency. While he was busy buying yachts he couldn't afford and impressing people who didn't care, Sophie was balancing the books. She didn't get mad. She got detailed. She took the very tools of his trade, the ledgers, the dates, the hidden accounts, and used them to dismantle his life brick by brick. It's a brutal ending for Julian, rotting in a cell while his ex-wife uses his own money to build a legacy. But you have to ask yourself, did he create the monster? Or did he just reveal the genius that was already there? I want to hear your take in the comments. Was Sophie's takeover of his assets justice, or was it too ruthless? If you were in her shoes, would you have kept the Vance money or burned it all down? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, destroy that like button. It really helps us get these stories out to more people. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Next week, we're covering a story about a Silicon Valley intern who was fired for thinking too small, only to build a competitor that bankrupted his former boss in 6 months. You do not want to miss that one. Until then, keep your receipts and stay solvent.